On November 16th, 2009, Kay Mortensen walked in the front door of his second home in Payson, Utah, a small city south of Salt Lake City. Most of the time, he and his wife Darla lived about 250 miles away, but Kay had a lot of valuable stuff in the Payson house, including at least 100 guns and rifles, and so he liked to check in on the property at least once a month. Kay was riding high these days. At 70 years old, he liked to say that he had finally found the love of his life in Darla. They had each raised separate families before finding each other 3 years earlier through the Mormon church, and now they work together as volunteer tour guides at a Mormon historic site, which was perfect for Kay, who was a retired Brigham Young University professor. This job allowed him to indulge his love for teaching and his love for Darla all at the same time. That day, Darla was heading out to babysit her granddaughters in Salt Lake City, so she'd be gone for hours, leaving Kay to do chores around the property all by himself. Now, the house was out in the country, kind of isolated and surrounded by woods, but Darla never worried about her husband when he was left alone at the house, because her husband, Kay, was not your typical retired professor. The man was a black belt in karate who always carried a gun and kept weapons in virtually every room of the house. Darla almost felt sorry for anyone who tried to tangle with Kay. Once, Kay shot a neighbor's Great Dane dog that he just said was threatening him, so he was obviously ready to pull the trigger. Darla kissed Kay goodbye, walked outside to her car, and then drove off to spend time with her grandkids. And once Darla was gone, Kay immediately stepped outside to inspect his pride and joy. Not many people knew about his pride and joy, but he had built an underground bomb shelter near the house where his family could take refuge when the inevitable nuclear war that he was so scared of finally began. Kay had constructed the shelter to very high professional standards, including an air filtration system and enough concrete to withstand a missile blast. There was even a bathroom and a composting toilet. Kay bent down and grabbed the handle of a heavy metal door that was sitting in the ground, and he opened it up, revealing a staircase. And then he went down those stairs and through another door, where he entered into the pitch-black shelter. Kay flipped on the lights and looked with satisfaction at the contents of his hideaway. There were canned foods and bottled water stacked to the ceiling. There was a small library of classic books and magazines, and there were 20 guns with ample ammunition. When Kay flipped another switch, he heard the electric hum of the air system kicking in. Everything was the way it should be. Kay knew that some people thought he was totally a crazy extremist whenever he talked about his belief that the United States was destined to be destroyed by nuclear war with the Russians or civil war right at home. But he was in good company in Utah. When he had taken a course in disaster preparedness a few years earlier, he was surrounded by familiar faces from the area, including Martin Bond, the son of one of Kay's closest friends. They had joked that Utah might be more ready for nuclear catastrophe than anywhere else in the world. And Kay had already made a fortune by predicting America's doom. He was so sure that the US dollar would soon become worthless that he had begun investing in gold as a young man. And sure enough, the price of gold had skyrocketed over the decades, and so now Kay was a multimillionaire. It was a good thing he'd made all that money, Kay thought as he walked back to the house from his bomb shelter. His oldest child, Roger, who lived just down the road in Payson, was constantly in need of money for one thing or another. Kay loved Roger, but his son, despite being 48 years old, really couldn't take care of himself, not since he suffered a severe head injury from driving his ATV off a cliff in 1994. Ever since then, Roger had not been able to hold a steady job for very long. Kay had already put his wealth into a trust that would be divided among his 3 kids, but he knew that Roger would continue to cost him money for the rest of his days. Despite Kay's misgivings about his son, he was looking forward to seeing Roger and his wife Pam that evening. Pam had called the night before to suggest they drop by to play board games before Kay and Darla went back to their primary home 250 miles away. The couple might be needy, Kay thought, but they were loyal. They never missed a chance to see him while he was in town. But first, Kay had chores to do that would take most of the day, including getting the house ready for another snowy Utah winter. Also, the internet service was acting kind of shaky, and so he had called a tech to come take a look. So when he heard a car pulling up the driveway around 4, he thought it might be the tech guy. And when the doorbell rang, Kay opened the door without giving it a second thought. Around 5:30 p.m., so less than an hour later, Kay's son, Roger, and daughter-in-law, Pam, pulled into Kay's driveway, and they could see that Kay had company. A blue hatchback car that they didn't recognize was sitting in front of the house. Pam figured it was a handyman helping Kay with his internet problems, or maybe replacing a worn-out carpet that Darla hated. Pam rang the doorbell with a smile on her face and a pecan pie in her hand, Kay's favorite. A friend at work had given Pam the pie as a gift that morning, and all day she couldn't wait to give it to Kay. But when the door opened, it was not Kay. Instead, a man in his 20s with a blank look on his face greeted them and let them inside, saying, "Don't worry, Kay was right upstairs." Two hours later, at about 7:45 p.m., a very strange 911 call came into the county sheriff's office that patrolled Payson. When the dispatcher answered, a woman with a calm voice told her that she and her husband had just been held hostage for the last 2 hours by gunmen inside of her father-in-law's house, and now the gunmen were gone, and so they were calling the police. The caller was, of course, Pam Mortensen. But when the dispatcher asked Pam for more details, Pam couldn't seem to remember a thing. She said there could have been maybe 3 gunmen, but she wasn't sure, and then when asked what any of them looked like, she said she didn't really get a good look, but they could have been African American. Meanwhile, in the background of this call from Pam, her husband, Roger, so Kay's son, yelled out a different account. He said there were 2 invaders, and they both were white. While Pam continued talking to the dispatcher, Roger yelled out that he was going to go check on his father, who was upstairs. And so Roger ran upstairs, and then moments later, Roger came back downstairs, and while Pam was still on the 911 call, Roger would say out loud that his father was dead. The dispatcher, who heard this, said that sheriff's deputies were on their way. A few minutes later, around 8 p.m., Kay's wife, Darla, who was driving home from her day with her grandchildren, got a call from her neighbor. Her neighbor was usually a laid-back person, but now he sounded totally anxious. He told Darla that there were all kinds of sheriff's deputies at her house in Payson. The friend had no idea what it was about, but he urged Darla to be careful when she went home. Darla hung up and had a horrible thought. What if Kay shot someone? He'd always said he'd kill anyone who tried to break into their house. Maybe it actually happened. Darla then repeatedly began calling Kay's cell phone, but he didn't pick up. And so in a panic, she called a friend and explained what was going on, and the 2 women agreed to meet near Darla's home in Payson at 8:30, and they would find out what was going on together. By 8:30 p.m. that night, yellow police tape blocked access to the driveway at Kay and Darla's house, and police cruisers lined the rural road leading up to it. Even the leader of the investigation, Sergeant Eric Knutson of the Utah County Sheriff's Office, had to park a 10 minutes walk away from the crime scene. But as soon as Knutson arrived at the house, a sheriff's deputy led him through the growing scrum of investigators into the house to the upstairs bathroom. And there, in the bathroom, was the body of Kay Mortensen. He was kneeling on the tile, bent half over his bathtub. His hands and feet were zip-tied together. As Knutson got closer, he could see that Kay's throat had been repeatedly slashed from ear to ear, and he had a deep stab wound in the back of his neck. Whoever had done this had first arranged Kay over the bathtub so that his blood didn't get all over the floor. It was almost like an execution. Knutson was a veteran detective who had seen lots of grisly crime scenes before, but the cruelty of what he was seeing in front of him made him a little bit nauseous. It also puzzled him. Kay was well known for his self-defense skills and his vow to defend his home with deadly force if necessary. How could this have happened? Downstairs in the living room, sheriff's deputies were trying to get more details from Kay's son, Roger, and his wife, Pam, the 2 who had called 911, but it was frustrating work. The couple repeatedly contradicted each other as they tried to describe what happened, or they would just shrug nonchalantly and say they didn't know the answer. Sergeant Knutson saw the looks of mounting annoyance on his deputies' faces as he came down the stairs and gestured for them to stop asking the couple questions. Knudsen then led Roger and Pam into the kitchen, where it was a little quieter, and he asked them to have a seat at the table. Knudsen then asked one of the deputies to videotape the conversation he was about to have, and then he told Roger and Pam to walk him through what had happened from the top. Knudsen's first impression of the couple was that they did not seem traumatized from their ordeal or even particularly sad that Roger's father had clearly just been murdered. Instead, they just kept glancing at each other and smirking like this was some sort of game. Pam explained that they were planning to spend the evening with Kay and Darla, but when they arrived at their house, they were greeted not by Kay and Darla, but by strangers with guns. Pam said that her husband, Roger, sensed trouble immediately and asked the gunmen if they could just take their pecan pie and leave. But the gunmen said no. And then another gunman said very simply, "You've seen our faces, and so now we have to kill you." Knudsen listened silently to Pam and Roger's story, but inside, he was thinking that it was totally ridiculous. So they were confronted by two men with guns, and their first thought was to try to get their pecan pie back? Shouldn't they have been more worried about Kay's safety or their own? Who would ever think first about saving a pie? But Knudsen let Pam continue. Pam said the gunman made them kneel in the living room, and then one of the men zip-tied their hands in front of them, while the other zip-tied their ankles. Then the two men just left Pam and Roger kneeling on the ground for a really long time, totally by themselves. Pam said while they were kneeling there, she just prayed to a picture of Jesus that Kay had hung in the living room, as much to calm herself as it was to calm her husband. Roger as well had begun praying loudly while they were kneeling there, and he was right in the middle of a sentence about the Lord being his shepherd when Pam started shushing Roger because she heard the gunman coming back. But to Pam's surprise, one of the gunmen told Roger to keep praying. Then both gunmen bowed their heads and silently listened as Roger asked God to spare his wife and him from harm. After Roger said amen, the gunmen said they had decided not to kill Pam and Roger after all. At this point, Knudsen just completely did not believe the couple. Pam and Roger were claiming that the same men who had just slaughtered Kay Mortensen like a hog decided not to kill the only witnesses because they were so moved by Roger's prayer? Are you kidding? But Knudsen didn't realize the story was actually about to get even more ridiculous. Pam and Roger continued and said that the gunmen had told them they would let the couple live on one condition. Pam and Roger should tell police that they were held hostage by 3 African-American men. That way, investigators would not go looking for the 2 young white men who actually committed the crime. One of the gunmen then took Roger's license from his wallet. If the couple told investigators what really happened, he said, they would come to their house and kill them. The couple then said they escaped from their zip ties as soon as they realized the gunmen were really gone, and then Pam immediately dialed 911. She told Knudsen she had to be vague with the 911 operator about the number and race of her attackers because she was trying to tell the lie that they had demanded. But she said Roger, who was kind of yelling in the background during this call, was telling the truth. It really was 2 white men in their early 20s with black hair and maybe a mustache or a goatee. And then Pam told Knudsen that Roger had run upstairs to find his father, bound hand and foot and slumped over the bathtub. Kay had bled profusely from deep wounds in his neck, and his body was cold to the touch. Roger knew immediately that his father had been murdered, and so he went downstairs and told Pam. To Knudsen, Roger just didn't seem that shaken up about his father's death. In fact, Roger seemed a little gleeful. As the video camera rolled, Roger told Knudsen that his father was a, quote, cantankerous old fart, end quote, who never stopped sharing his opinions. He also volunteered that, now that Kay was dead, he was likely to inherit millions of dollars from his father's estate. Sergeant Knudsen thought the whole story was absolute nonsense, except for the part about Roger inheriting millions now that his dad was dead. Knudsen was mildly offended that Pam and Roger would expect him to believe their cover story. This was not his first day on the job, and these two seemed totally guilty. Kay's wife Darla finally reached the police tape across the driveway to her house a little after 9 p.m., feeling totally exhausted from worrying over the past hour. At this point, she was still expecting to hear about something Kay had done to another person, like shoot them or something. But when Darla identified herself to the sheriff's deputy guarding the driveway, he immediately led her and her friend inside to Sergeant Knudsen, who had a grim look on his face. He said he was so sorry, but he had very bad news. Darla's husband was dead. Darla immediately fell against her friend as the world that she and Kay had built dissolved in an instant. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of her stepson Roger just standing in the corner looking beleaguered. Darla ran to him and hugged him tight as she started to weep. The two just stood there in a silent embrace for a long time. Sergeant Knudsen watched Darla as she leaned on Roger weeping, and he felt a pang of sorrow for her. But he also knew he was leading a murder investigation that just couldn't wait. If Pam and Roger were actually telling the truth, then that meant the gunmen were still at large, posing a huge threat to other people. Knudsen at this point basically did not believe Pam and Roger's story, but he still wanted to give them a chance to fully explain themselves. The stakes were simply too high to do anything else. So, late on the night of the murder, he asked Roger and Pam to come back to the sheriff's office so they could go over everything that happened again, but in a quieter, more peaceful setting. By this point, investigators had done a first sweep of Kay and Darla's home, and they had discovered that about 20 guns in Kay's bomb shelter were now missing. But if the killers were there to rob Kay, why had they only taken 20 guns? Kay had way more guns in the house, some of which were so valuable that Kay kept them in a safe. It made Knudsen wonder if the theft of a small portion of the guns was just a part of Pam and Roger's cover story to try to draw suspicion away from themselves. So Sergeant Knudsen sent Pam and Roger to separate interview rooms so the investigators could compare Pam's answers to Roger's to see if there were any differences. And almost immediately, Pam and Roger's stories began to go in different directions. Roger said the gunmen were wearing, quote, blue fuzzy gloves, end quote. Pam said they were wearing purple surgical gloves. Roger said he freed them both from the zip ties with the knife he was carrying. Pam said she freed herself. Knudsen, sitting across the empty interview table from Pam, finally just stopped asking questions and just stared at her with a mixture of incredulity and irritation. Then Sergeant Knudsen took a deep breath and told Pam point blank, "I think your story is a bunch of crap." And then he asked her flat out if her husband was capable of murder. Specifically, could Roger have killed Kay just to get his inheritance early? Pam replied that she didn't think so, and then quickly added, quote, "I personally would not have had my father-in-law killed for money," end quote. But that's exactly what Knudsen thought was really going on, that they had killed him for money. And later that night, when Sergeant Knudsen showed the videotape of the interviews with Roger and Pam to Kay's wife, Darla, Darla began thinking the same thing. Roger and Pam were clearly acting very suspicious. By the next morning, Knudsen and his team had figured out a few things about the death of Kay Mortensen. The crime scene itself was very neat, with no fingerprints, blood spatters, or signs of a struggle for investigators to analyze. That suggested that the crime was totally planned out ahead of time, but it also suggested something more. Kay may have knew his killers. Here was a man who carried a gun at all times because he was so worried about his personal safety, and he was a black belt in karate, but he apparently let the murderers right into the house without any problem. The investigators also realized that their victim was the kind of person who had rubbed a lot of people the wrong way over the years. Stubborn and quick-tempered, Kay had been through 2 divorces before he met Darla, and he was estranged from one of his sons over a fight about money. Over the years, he had fought with Brigham Young colleagues, a business partner, and of course, the woman who owned the Great Dane that he had shot. At the same time, Kay had close friends going back decades, people like Martin Bond, the other guy who was very into doomsday prepping, as well as Martin's father, Mike, and they both lived nearby in Payson. Kay had helped them both cope with the death of Martin's older brother in 1997. Also, Kay could be very generous, loaning money to friends and family in need without really ever pressing for repayment. And so as a result, Kay had died with lots of people who owed him money. And so investigators came up with this long list of people who had something to gain from Kay's death, from revenge to debt forgiveness. But they struggled to identify anyone who would have been motivated to actually kill him. Roger and Pam suggested a guy named Mike Kipp, who apparently was so broke he had recently sold some of his guns to Kay to raise some money. And it just so happened that those were the very same guns that the gunman took from the bomb shelter. And so maybe, they suggested, Kipp just wanted his guns back. But Roger's own relatives increasingly suspected that Roger may have been involved in his father's death, and they let Knutson's team know that Roger had a history of violence. He had once aimed a gun at a vehicle full of Boy Scouts when he was riding on his ATV, and his third ex-wife had accused him of throwing her against the wall and slapping her. He had also battled a drug addiction in the years after his head injury. Roger admitted to having a troubled past, but he insisted that that was the past before he met Pam and settled down. And he loved his father. They had bonded over their love of guns and often traded weapons. He considered his dad to be his best friend and said that he gave him money anytime he asked for it, and he also helped him break his addiction to drugs, and so why would he want to kill his dad? But when Roger agreed to take a lie detector test, he failed it. The analyst concluded that Roger was trying to be deceptive. Investigators tracked down the suspect that Pam and Roger had suggested, Mike Kipp, to see if he could have conceivably killed Kay to get his guns back. But Kipp told the sheriff's deputies who came to his house that he was not at all angry at Kay. He was grateful that Kay was willing to pay him $25,000 for some 30 weapons, money that he desperately needed. He was distraught over Kay's murder, and he had witnesses who knew Kipp was nowhere near Kay's house on the day Kay was killed. Sergeant Knutson quickly decided that Mike Kipp did not kill Kay Mortensen. Meanwhile, Knutson's deputies were having a hard time confirming key parts of Pam and Roger's story about the home invaders. They couldn't find the mysterious blue hatchback that Pam and Roger said was parked in the driveway, and the two white male suspects were given such a generic description by Pam and Roger that really they could be hundreds of people. Also, Pam and Roger just consistently behaved like they were hiding something throughout the entire investigation, even before they had struggled with the lie detector tests. Knutson and his boss decided it was time to turn up the heat on the couple to see if they would crack. The sheriff's deputies still had no direct evidence that the couple actually harmed Kay or hired others to do it for them, but Knutson just felt like it was a matter of time before they confessed. On February 2nd, 2010, more than 10 weeks after Kay's murder, the sheriff's office announced to the media that Pam and Roger were persons of interest in Kay's murder. Investigators filed a court document laying out the inconsistencies in the couple's statements about the day of the murder and pointing out that Roger had a criminal history that included both violent threats and theft. Roger had been found guilty, but mentally ill, by a jury for stealing tools from the hardware store where he worked. A judge sentenced him to 45 days of home confinement, saying his depression was not an excuse for criminal behavior. The sheriff's office also complained that Pam and Roger had stopped cooperating with the investigation. Basically, investigators had stopped just short of actually saying that Pam and Roger were the murderers. Pam and Roger were now totally isolated. The entire Mortensen clan believed they were the murderers, except for one of Roger's aunts. However, she didn't think they were innocent. She just thought they hired a hitman to carry out the crime. Over the coming months, detectives would pore over every detail of Pam and Roger's life, while county prosecutors convened a secret grand jury to determine whether the evidence was enough to put the couple on trial. Sheriff's deputies also searched their home and cars, finding illegal weapons as well as marijuana. Finally, on July 29, 2010, 8 months after Kay's murder, the grand jury indicted Pam and Roger for murder. Prosecutors said the couple had misled investigators from the very first 911 call, and they never stopped misleading the investigation. Authorities were certain they were the ones who brutally killed Kay and then tried to make it look like a robbery gone bad. On the same day of the indictment, a team of armed sheriff's deputies showed up at Pam and Roger's door, accompanied by TV cameras. When Pam and Roger came to the door, the deputy told them they were under arrest for the murder of Kay Mortensen. They were booked into the Utah County Jail and ordered to be held until they could raise $500,000 bail. That night, 150 miles to the east in the town of Vernal, Utah, a young woman named Rachel Bingham watched the TV news showing Roger and Pam being let out of their home in handcuffs. The reporter said that the two would soon face trial for killing Roger's own father so that he could collect his inheritance earlier. Rachel shuddered as she watched the TV. She had been keeping a secret for months, and it was absolutely destroying her. She knew she needed to come clean to investigators. A couple of days later, on July 31st, Rachel finally got up the courage to call the Utah County Sheriff's Office. She was on the verge of tears as she began talking to the sheriff's deputy on the other end of the line. She told them that she had been withholding vital information about the Mortensen murder since March and had been trying to block the whole tragedy from her mind as the case against Pam and Roger progressed. But when she saw on TV that the couple was about to be tried for murder, Rachel said she just could not remain silent any longer. Rachel explained that she had just divorced her husband, who happened to know a lot about the Mortensen murder. Rachel didn't talk to her ex anymore, but right before their divorce, when they were still trying to work things out last March, he had told her that he really needed her help. Then he let her in on a huge secret. He said he knew who killed Kay Mortensen, and he even had the evidence to prove it. He had the guns that had been stolen from Kay's bomb shelter. But Rachel said her ex-husband feared that the killer was going to find the guns unless he found a new place to hide them, and so this was why he needed Rachel's help. And so, against her better judgment, Rachel had rented a U-Haul truck, and then she and her ex-husband had filled it with those 20 guns that had been stolen from Kay. Then, early on March 31st, the two drove into the desert near Vernal with their young son sitting in between them. Eventually, Rachel's ex directed Rachel into a wilderness park full of cliffs up to 100 feet high. Then the three of them walked down a trail into the woods until Rachel's ex-husband picked a secluded spot and began digging a hole to bury the guns in. After her ex-husband had tamped down the freshly overturned soil with a shovel and covered it with branches, he made Rachel promise not to tell anyone about the weapon stash. Otherwise, her ex-husband said, his life could be in danger. And so Rachel had kept her word until now. The deputy asked Rachel to please come into the sheriff's office for a formal interview. Rachel wiped away her tears and said she would. She had no choice. And so, the next day, Rachel drove to the sheriff's office in Provo, Utah to meet with Detective Knutson and his team, and as soon as she was settled down on a couch in front of the video camera, she began talking. Based on what Rachel told detectives, and also the detectives' follow-up investigation, here's what really happened on November 16th, 2009, the day Kay Mortensen was murdered. At about 5 p.m., the two killers pulled into Kay Mortensen's driveway inside of a blue hatchback vehicle. Their plan was to steal Kay's prized gun collection, but just in case, they were each carrying handguns if Kay gave them any trouble. But their motive was definitely robbery. The ringleader of this duo had serious money problems, and his sidekick could use some cash too. When the killers rang the doorbell, Kay instantly recognized the leader as someone who had been inside of his house many times, and so naturally he invited the pair into the house without any hesitation. The ringleader felt a surge of excitement as soon as they stepped through the door. His plan was actually working. Almost immediately, the killers pulled out their guns and handed Kay zip ties. They told him to bind his own wrists. Kay had seemed both surprised and annoyed to be treated so rudely by a friend, but he did as they asked. He then pointed out that his wife would be home soon, so they didn't have much time for whatever it was they wanted to do. The men said nothing in return and just put on latex gloves to make sure they did not leave behind fingerprints. Once their gloves were on, they told Kay that they wanted to know where to find his gun collection. The ringleader said he knew that Kay had scores of weapons, including very valuable antiques, so where were they? Kay directed the men to the guns in his bomb shelter without telling them about a much larger and much more valuable collection he kept inside of a safe. Even with guns pointed at him, Kay did not want to give up his best weapons. But the killers didn't question Kay, and instead, they took all the guns from the shelter and loaded them into the blue hatchback. But then, the home invasion took a dark turn. After loading all of the guns into the hatchback, the two killers went back inside the house, they grabbed Kay, and began walking him towards the stairs that led to the upstairs bathroom. As they passed through the kitchen, the sidekick happened to grab a butcher's knife. Now, the ringleader had not planned to kill Kay. But for some reason, after the sidekick had grabbed the knife and clearly showed he was going to use it on Kay, the ringleader just kind of went along with it. And so the two killers just walked Kay up the stairs into the bathroom, and they forced him over the side of the bathtub so his torso was kind of hanging in the tub and his legs were out. And then one of the two killers took the knife and began sawing at the front of Kay's neck. And as they did this, Kay began screaming in pain, and then after sawing away at his neck for a while, one of the killers took the knife, raised it high into the air, and then plunged it straight down into the back of Kay's neck. A blow he had seen used before in gladiator movies. Kay's body had barely gone limp when the killers heard the front doorbell ring. The sidekick got down to the door first, and he let Pam and Roger into the house as the leader was coming down the stairs as well. The sidekick then calmly told the couple that they were going to kill them. Roger immediately started crying, but Pam, she stayed cool. The killers zip-tied Pam and Roger's wrists and ankles and then left them kneeling in the living room for 45 minutes while the killers cleaned up the crime scene. But when they returned, Roger was praying aloud and the gunman stopped and quietly listened. The ringleader told his accomplice that there could be no more killing today, and the two men agreed to let the couple live as long as they blamed the crime on 3 African-American men. It would turn out Pam and Roger had actually been telling the truth the whole time. Then the two killers drove away from the scene with their stash of guns. They went out into the desert and buried them, figuring they would sell them when publicity about the murder died down. But as the investigation went on for months and months, the ringleader started to worry that his accomplice might turn the weapons into authorities and try to pin the murder on him. That's why he had asked Rachel to rent the U-Haul in March. The ringleader of the crime was Rachel's ex-husband, Martin Bond, whose father happened to be a dear friend of Kay Mortensen. 22-year-old Martin had been to Kay's house from time to time since he was a little boy, and he had bonded with Kay as an adult when they both took an emergency preparedness course together. Bond insisted to his ex-wife that he had only planned to rob Kay, not kill him, and that he had been powerless to stop his 22-year-old accomplice, Benjamin Rettig, from slaughtering Kay. In the end, the partners in crime turned on each other. Rettig claimed the whole crime was Bond's idea. Rettig said Bond had first told him about the robbery plan the day they actually carried it out, and he also insisted that Bond was the one who actually killed Kay. Rettig pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life. As for Bond, he claimed he was innocent, but a jury convicted him and sentenced him to life without parole. He later admitted in jail that he had been the one who slashed Kay's throat, but he said he only did it because his partner, Rettig, had a gun aimed at him. As for Pam and Roger, they were released from jail on December 7, 2010, after 4 months of incarceration, and the prosecutor's office said the couple was fully exonerated. The couple sued the Utah County Sheriff's Department and prosecutors for falsely accusing them of murder. However, the lawsuit was tossed out because the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that no one can sue over inaccurate testimony made to a grand jury.
In 1947, a disturbing distress signal was sent out kind of in all directions, like a blind distress signal, from some point in the Indian Ocean. Numerous American, Dutch, and English ships, along with other international listening stations, heard this distress signal. And once they triangulated where it was coming from, they sent out a search party to go see who needed help. When they arrived on scene, they discovered something that would become one of the most famous maritime mysteries of all time. This is the story of the SS Ourang Medan. What's going on, guys? MrBallen here. I was a Navy SEAL for a little while, and now I tell strange, dark, and mysterious stories on the internet. YouTube is my new passion, and I'm going to be posting at least 2 times a week going forward. And if you like this kind of content, please right now hit like on this video and subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss any of this stuff. Thank you very much. Before we get into the story, I want you guys to be looking at this through the lens of trying to decipher whether or not you believe this really happened, because there is a large percentage of people that say this is just an urban legend. However, there is a couple details that make it really hard to just write off. Number one, you have a number of international ships and listening stations that all reported hearing this same distress signal, and it's a very unique distress signal that we'll get into. In addition, you have the US Coast Guard in one of their, fairly credible publications published a story about this case 5 years after it happened. And then you have the fact that this case has been around since 1947. It's been 70 plus years and no one's officially debunked it. So let's dive in. In 1947, several Dutch, American, and English ships, along with a number of listening stations, picked up the strange distress signal that was coming from somewhere in the Indian Ocean. The distress signal, which was in Morse code, went like this.
An officer, including the captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge. Possibly whole crew dead.
Then there was a burst of indecipherable Morse code, and then it ended with 2 words.
I die.
Then silence. One ship that heard this distress signal was the Silver Star. It was an American vessel that was kind of patrolling the waterways around the coast of Malaysia, and with the help of other ships in and around the Indian Ocean and some of the listening stations, they were able to triangulate the location of this distress signal. And they pinpointed a ship called the SS Ourang Medan that was located right at the end of the Strait of Malacca, which is the primary shipping lane between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And so this ship was basically drifting out towards the Indian Ocean. And so the first thing that the Silver Star does is they try to send a message back to the Ourang Medan. But after numerous failed attempts, the captain of the Silver Star decides that we need to go investigate because something is obviously not right here. So the Silver Star tells all the other ships in the area, along with the other listening stations, that they are going to be the search party. They're going to reroute and head for the Ourang Medan, because at this point, anybody that had heard that signal is saying, like, what do we do? Like, are we going to go investigate? Are you? After a couple of hours of heading straight for the Ourang Medan, they see off in the distance the ship. From the eyes of these very experienced sailors on the Silver Star, they knew almost immediately that this ship is dead in the water. It's just drifting, which is not a good sign, especially if you combine that with the signal they got. As they get closer and closer to this ship, it becomes creepier and creepier because they're looking up, and in the bridge where the steering wheel would be, they can't make any person out. There's no one up there. There's nobody standing on the edge. I mean, they just sent this distress signal. You would think with a ship that's dead in the water that they would be lining the outside of the ship trying to signal someone down. But no, it's just quiet. No one on board, all lights off, just drifting, bobbing in the choppy waters of the Indian Ocean. And so as they get closer, they start blowing their whistle to try to attract anybody on the Ourang Medan to signal them back. They're also doing more Morse code to try to get their attention again, not being picked up. And so finally, after all these failed attempts and just the general weirdness around it, the captain of the Silver Star decides, we need to board this ship. So the Silver Star crew members, they knew before they boarded that almost definitely they were going to find something terribly wrong with this ship. There's just too many red flags about it. They were anticipating something bad, but I don't think that they were really prepared for just how bad this was going to be. So they board the ship, and right away on deck is a number of crew members that had passed away. They're all deceased. And the mystery really kicks in the position, the body position of all of the dead crew members. They were all on their back with their hands outstretched in front of them, as if defending themselves from some unseen assailant above them. Even strangers, they had this look of abject terror on their face, as if the final moments before they died were just excruciatingly painful and terrifying. Even the dog was in a position with its teeth bared. It looked like it was growling up into the sky. All of them. And so obviously the Silver Star crew members are, shocked at what they find. And they're kind of looking at each of these dead crew members and they're like, what is going on? So they make their way up to the bridge, and everybody's also dead in the same position, basically fighting with some unseen assailant in their final moments before they pass. The person who had been sending out the distress signal had literally slouched over the telegraph. Like, their finger was literally on the telegraph. He's the only one that was not doing this. He was on the telegraph and had passed away in that position. So they go down into the bowels of the ship. Normally, inside of a steel ship in the boiler room, it's going to be pretty hot. There's no real ventilation to speak of. Not to mention outside, it was over 100 degrees. They went down into the boiler room and down into the ship, and it was strikingly cold. Some of the crew members from the Silver Star said it felt like it might have been about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They found more crew members also passed away, also fighting with something in the air, with that look of abject terror on their face. So all of the crew has perished in this very bizarre way. There was no overt damage to the ship. It just appeared that the engine had been turned off, but ultimately the ship had no real damage to it at all. They couldn't find anything. The crew, despite meeting a fairly unfortunate end, also had no signs of outside injury, external injury. Something had obviously caused them all to perish, but there was no injuries outside their body. In addition, all of them showed signs of rapidly decomposing. Considering they had just been tapping away that distress signal hours earlier, unless the person communicating the distress signal had been the last one alive for a long time, it doesn't really add up that they had decomposed as quickly as they had relative to when this distress signal was sent. So the captain of the Silver Star, taking into account all of the strangeness, decides not to touch any of the bodies, leave them where they are, get off the ship, tie a tow line to the Ourang Medan, and tow it in. We're going to have experts look at this and figure out what happened. And so they attach the tow line, the crew members of the Silver Star, and as soon as they begin to move it, they notice, the crew of the Silver Star, that smoke has begun billowing out of the inside of the Ourang Medan. And so, not taking any chances, they cut the tow line and they literally jump back onto the Silver Star right as the Ourang Medan explodes. In fact, there was a quote which basically said it exploded with so much force that it was lifted out of the water entirely and then splashed back down and rapidly sank. So now you have no evidence. You have the testimony of the people that were on the ship, but other than that, you have no evidence. The ship is now gone. The captain of the Silver Star and his crew just have to go back to the mainland to try to make sense of what they just saw, because you have all these people that were involved and want to know what happened, and they're like, well, let me tell you, we saw this horrible thing on board and then it exploded and it disappeared. And so that's where the mystery kind of ends. But here we go. Let's get into what the primary critique is, because that's important to hear too. And then we'll hear the rebuttal, which I think is also pretty important. So people that believe this story is just a legend will point to the fact that there really isn't a good record of the SS Ourang Medan ever existing. There's this one very important publication called Lloyd's Shipping Registers, where you would expect the Ourang Medan to be registered, but they're not. Others will say that, well, Ourang Medan translates to man of Medan, and Medan is near Sumatra, and that's where they were registered. So they weren't in Lloyd's Shipping Registers, they were in another registry. But either way, there is contention around whether or not this ship ever existed. But for those who say that this could be true, they say that, well, there's a good reason why those records don't exist, because someone's trying to cover it up. According to a German researcher who had spent decades covering the Ourang Medan case, he published in the Death Ship on the South Seas, it's a publication from 1953, that the Ourang Medan was transporting illegal materials, things like nitroglycerin and potassium cyanide. These are things used to create weapons. And there might have been a leak that led to the death of everyone on board. No physical injuries, but they passed away. And then also, after they tied that tow line, the materials could have detonated. Perhaps they detonated, that kind of thing. And so that still leads some questions, right? I mean, then how did the Silver Star crew not also get exposed to these chemicals as soon as they got there? Either way, it's a fascinating story, and I hope that you took something from it. So if you haven't already, I would really appreciate it if you liked this video and you hit subscribe on my channel. I will be posting at least 2 times a week going forward, content just like this, so I hope you'll join. And that's going to do it, guys. Thank you. In 1993, Ludmila Korovina, who was a 41-year-old Russian hiking instructor, came under fairly intense criticism from her colleagues for being too survivalist with her students. They thought she was a little bit too aggressive with how she pushed her students, putting them in unnecessarily risky situations out in the wild where they weren't really ready for it, and at any point, she might push them too far and wind up getting someone killed. Her students, however, absolutely adored her. They said on the mountains, she was fearless and in tune with nature, and they felt very safe around her. And then at camp, she was very motherly and tender and always took the time to make sure all of her students were taken care of well before she was. Former students have said the mentorship they received from Ludmila went well beyond just hiking instruction. They said she taught a mindset that they carried with them into adulthood, and they pointed to as one of the main reasons they were successful later in life. In the summer of 1993, Ludmila was scheduled to lead an expedition up to the Khamar Daban Ridge, which is in eastern Siberia, and it's one of the oldest mountains on the planet. With her on this expedition would be 6 fairly experienced hiking students that ranged in ages from 15 to 24 years old. One of those 6 students was a 23-year-old young man named Sasha, who, although he was not Ludmila's biological son, she called him her son because she had raised him ever since he was a young child, and he looked at Ludmila as his mother. Sasha also happened to be the most physically fit and competent of all 6 hiking students, and he would function more like an assistant to Ludmila on this particular hike rather than a pupil. The other 5 students were 24-year-old Tatiana, 19-year-old Dennis, 16-year-old Victoria, 15-year-old Timur, and 17-year-old Valentina, who she is the only reason we know anything about the horrible things that happened to this group up on Khamar Daban Ridge. On August 1st, 1993, Ludmila and her hiking group boarded a Trans-Siberian railway car in Kazakhstan, and later that day they arrived in a town called Marino, which is on the eastern side of Siberia on the southern end, and it butts up against the base of the Khamar Daban mountain range. The Khamar Daban mountain was not considered a very dangerous hike to make. It was relatively small. It was just under 2,400 meters in elevation, and in the summertime, you'd have scores of recreational hikers all over this mountain range. Plus, the weather forecast for Ludmila and her group's multi-day hike in that mountain range was going to be incredibly favorable. It was going to be warm, clear, nice summer weather. Ludmila had charted a course that began just outside of the town of Marino, which is the town they were staying in that first night. They were going to start next to Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in Russia. From the lake, they were going to move north and inland over this stretch that was totally barren. There was no trees, it was just rocks and grass, before ultimately reaching the Khamar Daban Ridge, which was their destination. And at that point, there would be shelter and firewood, and they could take a break before ultimately descending. And so in total, from the lake all the way to Khamar Daban Ridge was approximately 50 miles. Ludmila's group would not be the only group making this particular movement towards Khamar Daban Ridge. They'd be taking their own path, but there'd be 2 other groups that were on similar courses, basically parallel to them, making their way up to the ridge. And one of those groups was actually led by Ludmila's 16-year-old biological daughter, and they had actually made plans to meet up on one of the last days of this multi-day hike. As they were making their descent, there was a forest they were going to meet up in. So Ludmila and her 6 students stayed the night in Marino, and the next morning they got up early and made their way over to Lake Baikal. The weather's beautiful, they're excited to start their journey, and they take off. And everything was going great until the late afternoon. It would turn out the weather forecasters were just completely wrong, and as soon as the group climbed above the tree line, the temperatures plummeted and it started raining and snowing on them. It was just absolutely miserable. This treacherous weather would persist over the next few days, and it really started to destroy the morale in the group. But Ludmila, she was a pro and she had hiked in far worse conditions than this. And so she made a point of telling the group that this stuff happens. Bad weather happens. We are prepared. We are trained. We're going to be fine. You need to have a positive attitude about this. We need to just keep pushing forward and not play victim here. And that was enough to inspire the group to just keep on going. They believed in Ludmila and she's telling them to keep going, so they kept going. By the evening of August 4th, so this is 3 full days of hiking later, they were only about 30 minutes away from the summit. They have now reached the point where they are in the open section of the mountain where there is no reprieve from the wind or the rain or the snow. There's no trees to block anything. And so it's just an absolute abomination trying to climb this last stretch. Every step is like an eternity as the wind just cuts through their clothes and they're soaking wet and miserable. Ludmila's students were not about to ask for a break. They knew how she operated. She was someone that really believed in pushing through your own pain and fatigue and misery, and she always led by example, and they saw her, right out in front leading the charge up towards the Khamar Daban ridge. And so they were very surprised when she stopped and she turned around and told them, we're taking a break. And in fact, we're actually going to camp out for the night right where we are right here. No one knows why Ludmila made this decision. On the one hand, it does make sense to take a break and say, you know what, we'll reach the summit tomorrow. We've had a really hard couple of days here with the bad weather. We'll make camp and we'll get some rest and we'll hit the summit tomorrow. That makes sense. But where she elected to make camp does not make sense. She had them stop right smack dab in the middle of this totally open section of the mountain where there are no trees, there's no objects to protect them from the horrible wind and snow and ice and rain that's just going to be pelting them all night. And so some people have speculated that when she looked at her crew of hikers, they were so badly beaten down and tired and miserable that she knew she could not ask them to go any further. And so that was why she said, let's just make camp here, we'll make do. Others have said her map may not have been very accurate. And so she didn't know how close she was to the summit, where at the summit there was literally a shelter that had firewood and a place for you to rest. Maybe she didn't know she was so close. Perhaps she thought she was much farther away and this is the best we can do. But what the inaccurate map theory does not account for is Ludmila would have known there is a forest about 2.5 miles down the mountain, because the whole time they've been on this hike, they've tried to stay up above the tree line as they make this final approach up to the ridge. And so she would have known there's a forest right down there. And if I wanted to, I could go down there and seek shelter in the trees. And so for whatever reason, she decided that we can't go down to the forest, we got to stay here. And so perhaps that lends more credibility to the idea that the group was far more beaten down than maybe we even realize. And she thought they can't make the 2.5 mile journey. We're going to have to just make camp here and make do. But regardless of her reasoning, they did make camp right in the middle of this open section. They set up 2 wet, crappy tents, and they used their little kerosene stoves to make a tiny meal. And then they all crammed inside of these 2 tents and huddled as the wind howled outside. That night, the storm got much worse. The wind picked up, and again, they're totally exposed on this open section of the mountain, and so they're just getting destroyed by this wind. And at about 2 a.m., the wind actually broke the ropes that were holding the tents down, and they had to go outside and retie them, and they were able to do that. And then a couple hours later, at about 4 a.m., the wind actually lifted up the section of the tent that was facing where the wind was blowing, and it pulled the tent up in such a way that water rushed into the tent and soaked their sleeping bags. And they were able to go outside and they put the stakes back down on the ground, but they were sleeping in wet sleeping bags in the middle of this mountain in the middle of a storm. So this is getting quite dangerous at this point. But they were able to eventually fall asleep, and at about 10 a.m. the next morning, Ludmila gets up and looks outside, and she can see that everything is frozen, that it's snowed and the temperatures have dropped again, and everything is just snow and ice. And she knows that, we're actually reaching very dangerous hypothermia territory, and if we don't warm up soon, this could be life-threatening. And so she woke everybody up and she said, we need to go down into that forest and we need to start a fire as soon as possible. And so everybody said, all right, they got up, they started packing up their things, rolled up their tents, and they began walking down the mountain in a line. Although this was not intended, when Ludmila had said we will reach the summit tomorrow, that had delayed their schedule, and it meant they were not going to be able to meet up with her daughter the next day. But now in the morning, when they're deciding basically to abandon the summit and turn around and head down again, they were now back on schedule to meet up with her daughter down in the forest. However, her daughter said she was at the rendezvous point in the forest, and Ludmila and the 6 other hikers never showed. 4 days later, on August 9th, a group of Ukrainian kayakers were making their way down this river in southern Siberia, and they were passing by the Khamar Daban mountain range. And so as they're kind of slowly moving their way down, it's this beautiful morning, and they're looking up at the mountains all around them. The leader of this group happens to see something move on his left side. There's a forest right up against the left side of this river, and he turns his head and he has to do a double take because there is this girl who's standing there at the edge of the forest looking out at them totally expressionless, and she's covered in blood. And she's not doing anything, she's just standing there. And at first, he actually thought, like, we need to leave. His first thought was, we need to just get away from this person. There's something wrong with this person. But very quickly, the group realized, like, we cannot abandon this girl. This is a young girl who should not be out here. I don't know what she's doing out here. And so they turned around and they went on shore and they yelled to her. They said, are you okay? And she just stood there not reacting, and they tried a couple more times to say, hey, we're not going to hurt you. We just want to know what's going on. And she didn't say a word. She just stood there in shock. She looked very scared. They finally got up right next to her and they asked her, what are you so scared of? Where are you coming from? And they just could not get her to speak. But they're up close looking at her, and she's got blood all over her. She looks dirty. She looks like she might be sick. And so they decide that this girl needs help, and they had blankets, and so they threw blankets over her. They put her in one of the kayaks and they brought her back to town. Once in town, the Ukrainian kayakers went and got authorities and said, hey, we found this girl. She was covered in blood walking out of the forest. We have no idea what's going on with her. And so authorities came over to speak to her, and although she barely spoke, she would finally say that she was 17 years old, her name was Valentina, and that she had been a part of a 7-person hiking group up along the Khamar Daban ridge. And then she paused, and they said, well, where's your hiking group? How did you get separated? This is what she told them. Back on the morning of August 5th, so this would have been the morning after that terrible night's sleep on the mountain where the tent ropes are breaking and their sleeping bags are getting soaking wet. Well, Valentina wakes up and she looks outside of the tent and she sees Ludmila, and she's standing there with her hands on her hips and she's looking around. She looks very concerned. Valentina goes out there and Ludmila turns to her and says, we need to leave. We need to go down to the forest and we need to make a fire. Can you help me wake everybody up and start having them pack up their stuff so we can get moving? And so Valentina goes in, she starts waking people up, and everybody very quickly packs up the tent, packs up their things, and they're in a line and they start walking down the mountain. They had only made it about 10 meters into their descent when Sasha, the 23-year-old young man that Ludmila considered her son, he just suddenly falls. And the other hikers, Valentina included, run over and they help get him up again, and he looks kind of shaken. He takes a couple more steps and he falls again. And this time, when Valentina goes over to try to help him up with the others, they see his eyes are wide and he looks like he's really terrified, and then blood starts rushing out of his nose and his ears and his mouth. And then he just suddenly dies. And Ludmila runs over and she grabs him and she's panicking and she's trying to feel for a pulse and she's checking for his heart. And then she screams out in pain and anguish and she yells, he's dead. The other hikers can't believe this is happening. They can't even process that someone, any of them, had died, let alone it be Sasha, the most physically fit and healthy one of all of them, including up until a few minutes ago. He wasn't showing any signs or symptoms that something was wrong. He was perfectly fine. What's going on? Ludmila was in shock. She's on the ground and she's holding on to Sasha, and she's telling the group that she's not going anywhere. She's staying with Sasha. And Valentina would say the group is just falling apart at this point. You have some of them that are crying, others who are just standing there looking around like, what's happening to us right now? And at some point, Ludmila collects herself and she says to the group, go down to the forest. Go down to the forest and start a fire. And Valentina said they didn't want to leave her and they were pleading with her to let them stay. And she said, no, go down to the forest and start a fire. And finally, Valentina said the group would. They'd get together and they'd turn around, and not really knowing what was going to happen next, they just begin walking down this mountain, and they only get a few steps before they hear Ludmila yell out to come back. She's saying, I can't move. And they turn around and Valentina was towards the front of the returning group as they're going back up the mountain back to Ludmila. And she's now bleeding out of her nose and her ears and her mouth. She's heaving like something's going on inside of her, and then all of a sudden she keels over on top of Sasha. And she dies right in front of them. And now the group is in hysterics. And Valentina's in the front and she can't see anybody else. And then she turns around and she can't believe what she's seeing to her side. Now everybody else is bleeding from their nose and their ears and their mouth, and some of them are frothing from the mouth. Valentina reached for her mouth and her ears and her nose to look for blood, and there wasn't any. And then she turned and she saw 16-year-old Victoria and 24-year-old Tatiana suddenly fall to the ground, just like Sasha had, except they weren't just laying there. They began rolling around and ripping their clothes off and clutching at their throats, and they're frothing at the mouth. And so Valentina reaches down to try to help Victoria, the 16-year-old, and Victoria bites her on the hand and she pulls her hand back. And then Victoria curls into a ball and then goes still. And then Tatiana begins hitting her head on a rock over and over and over again until she goes still. At this point, Valentina is in pure survival mode, and so she looks at the other two, which was 15-year-old Timur and 19-year-old Dennis. Everybody else is down on the ground at this point. And she sees Dennis is moving behind a rock, and he looks like he's not acting as erratic as everybody else. And so she starts making her way over to Dennis to see if he's going to be okay. And on the way, she sees 15-year-old Timur fall to the ground, and he's suddenly lying there still. And so she believes he's dead too. She gets over to Dennis, and he's bleeding profusely from all of his orifices in his head, but he's talking to her. And he's saying, okay, you need to go back to your bag, get out whatever you can that is essential, ditch the rest, and run down to the forest, and I'll meet you down there. And so Valentina says, okay. She makes her way up to her bag. She gets her sleeping bag and a couple other small items. And when she turns around to go back to Dennis, she sees that he's now slouched over his backpack, and now the blood is just pouring out of his head. And she can tell that almost certainly he's dead as well. And so not only is she all alone, she's now totally traumatized and believes whatever has happened to them is going to happen to her. And so she runs down the mountain and she goes into the forest and she gets underneath this rock overhang. She puts her sleeping bag down, she crawls inside, and she drifts in and out of consciousness for the rest of the day. And then that night, she's still laying there and the storm picked up dramatically, and she could hear all night these huge trees all over the mountain falling and slamming all around her. And so she's thinking, if I don't die from whatever killed my friends, I'm going to get hit by one of these trees. But she manages to get through the night. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and so Valentina gets up, and she's thinking to herself, maybe by some miracle, one of them is still alive. And so she climbs back up the mountain to where they were, and she finds all of them still laying exactly where they were when she left them, all motionless, all deceased. And so she decides to go one by one and close each of their eyelids, and then she says her goodbye, and then she turns and kind of wanders back into the forest, where she would stay for the next 4 days, desperately walking around, hoping to be rescued at some point, the whole time just expecting to die, either from exposure, from an animal attack, from whatever killed my friends. Eventually she does hear voices and she starts making her way towards where they're coming from, and that's when she gets to the river and she sees the Ukrainian kayakers who ultimately pick her up and bring her back to town. After authorities heard Valentina's story and realized there were other hikers out there, they launched a search party, and it would take them a month to locate them. Their bodies were contorted and their faces were locked in these grimaces that looked like they were in absolute terror and agony right as they died. In addition to missing most of their clothing and their shoes, they were also all missing their eyeballs. The autopsies were only able to conclude that hypothermia contributed to their death, although it wasn't the only factor, as well as a protein deficiency, despite the fact that they had all eaten well over the course of their trip, and that all of their lungs were very bruised, but they didn't know what that was from. But nothing the autopsy concluded could reconcile what Valentina said she saw happen, which was a sudden, violent death of 6 healthy people with no signs and symptoms leading up. Suddenly, they are bleeding out of every orifice and they're falling to the ground, tearing their clothes off, grabbing at their throats, frothing at the mouth, and then dying. And whatever happened to them, why didn't it happen to Valentina? To this day, we don't really have a good answer why that happened, and the case is closed. It was ruled they mostly died of hypothermia and it was an accident, and that's that. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened in Russia. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, and about 10 days into their hike, they reached a part where they needed to crest over this mountain before some bad weather rolled in. And they started moving up this mountain, which would be renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of this group. His name is Dyatlov. They started making their way up the Dyatlov Pass, and they were going too slowly, and the weather was coming in too quickly. And so they had to make a critical decision. Stay put, but be in this totally exposed, open mountain face, much like the Khamar Daban situation where they were up on that open mountain face. Either hunker down there and get ruined by weather, and the weather was a lot worse for the Dyatlov Pass group. It was, sub-zero temperatures and just snowing ruthlessly. Or they could go down and give up ground and go down to the forest at the base of this mountain where you'd be sheltered from the storm with some trees. And so these hikers who might be a little bit overconfident in their ability decide to stick it out right on this mountain face. And over the course of that night, at some point, they cut open their tent with a knife from the inside and ran out into sub-zero temperatures, most of them not wearing shoes, not wearing jackets, not wearing pants. They're basically in underwear. And they calmly walked down the mountain all the way down to the forest. And once they got down there, two of them tried to desperately climb this big tree where there wasn't any low-hanging branches. And so they couldn't climb up it. We don't know what they were trying to climb up it for, but they ended up building this little tiny fire that could not have provided very much warmth at all. And they were found deceased lying around this fire. The 7 other hikers were found in 2 different areas. One that appeared to go down to that tree where those 2 were, but then doubled back and tried to get up to the campsite, but didn't make it and fell to the ground and died there. The other group was not found for a couple of weeks later. They were found at the mouth of this river. They were inside of this den, and they were wearing the clothes of the other hikers that were deceased. And the clothes they had on had traces of radiation on them. And the ones that were in the den had these devastating chest and skull injuries, and one of them was missing their eyeballs. And the official statement by the Soviet Union was they died from an unknown compelling force, which is a really mysterious way to describe how someone might die. This case was actually reinvestigated in 2020, and the new cause of death is death by avalanche, except loads of people disagree with that. In fact, experts have gone out to where this happened, and they say not only was there no avalanche, there's never been an avalanche in this area. There's literally never been one. So what do you think? Is there a connection between Khamar Daban and the Dyatlov Pass incident? Is there a cover-up in both cases where something far more sinister has happened to both groups that we don't know about? Or are they unrelated and these are just both examples of Mother Nature being far more powerful than we even realize?
The next and final story of today's episode is a MrBallen fan favorite. It's called Bell's Canyon.
In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman, and so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down, and periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do, so he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent, and this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him, and the guy's eyes go wide, and he stands up, turns around, and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this, and so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm gonna look out and I'm gonna see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm gonna see his campsite. You know, maybe he's set up nearby, and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees, any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one. There's no fire, there's no flashlight, there is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here, and stranger things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time he can't really just write it off. Clearly there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone, and clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, "I don't know where Bell's Canyon is." And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question a bit more forcefully this time.
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
his voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's gonna fall, get hurt, he's gonna get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away, and so Matt just goes back to his campsite, and he's thinking to himself, what do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was gonna be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 a.m, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again, he didn't see him again, and he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's gonna pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. Then the sun came up, Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched. He was totally terrified. And then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent. And he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point, when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, grabbed his knife, and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds, and he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot, he got to a nearby hotel, he finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime, he was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear. And all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please kidnap the 5-star review button and then force them to brush their teeth with a very minty toothpaste. When they're done, make them drink a huge glass of orange juice. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallin, and I really